A person can stand in the cold wearing layers of advanced fabric, sealed boots, thermal gloves, insulated pants, and a jacket built in a laboratory, and still make a fatal mistake within an hour. Another person, 2 centuries earlier, could move through deep winter with clothing that now looks crude, sleep close to frozen ground, wake under a skin shelter stiff with frost, and keep going. That contrast feels backward at first. We tell ourselves that history moves in one direction, that better materials produce better survival, that people from the past endured cold mainly because they had no choice. But the old trappers who crossed the mountains, river valleys, and high plains did not last in winter because they were reckless or because they were somehow made of harder flesh. They lasted because they treated cold as a system to be read, not an enemy to be beaten by equipment. And before we go farther, if you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through the past, subscribe and stay with me. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what hour it has reached where you are. There is something fitting about a story like this, traveling through darkness, from one late room to another, while people far apart imagine the same wind, the same frost, and the same long white country. One of the easiest ways to misunderstand frontier winter life is to imagine it as one endless test of toughness. That version is common now because it is simple. It turns mountain men into figures of brute endurance, half buried in snow, surviving through grit alone. But winter does not reward the person who tries to overpower it. Cold strips away the illusions that work in milder weather. It does not care how confident someone feels. It does not care how expensive the gear is, how strong the body looks, or how modern the design might be. It only cares about small exchanges that are almost invisible at first. Heat leaving the skin, damp fabric holding moisture, wind slipping through a seam, effort turning into sweat, hunger lowering the body's output, fatigue slowing judgment, darkness arriving before shelter is ready, a hand losing sensation too gradually to alarm the mind. This is part of why cold has always been such a quiet killer. Fire, falling, flood, and battle announce themselves. Extreme cold often begins like a mild inconvenience, a little numbness, a little stiffness, a slight slowing of movement, breath in front of the face, fingers that do not quite obey. A person feels discomfort and believes discomfort is the whole problem. But discomfort is not the true measure of danger. In many cases, the most dangerous winter decisions are made before fear ever arrives. A traveler overheats on the climb, opens clothing too late, sweats into inner layers, rests too long after movement, underestimates the wind, trusts the day to remain stable, or pushes on because modern thinking has trained us to assume that equipment can cover the gap between optimism and reality. The men who moved through the beaver trade country in the early 19th century did not have that assumption. They could not afford it. Their world stretched across the upper Missouri country, the Rocky Mountain valleys, the Snake River country, the Green River Basin, the Great Salt Lake region, the Yellowstone drainages, and countless unnamed crossings where weather could turn a routine movement into a final one. They traveled in places where help was not a delayed phone call or a rescue beacon. Help was often days away, if it existed at all. There was no warm truck waiting behind the ridge, no heated building down the road, no certainty that a bad decision could be repaired by speed. Because of that, they had to learn something most people now rarely learn in full. Survival in severe cold begins long before a person feels endangered. That kind of learning was not abstract. It came from repetition so constant that weather ceased to be background. It became structure. A trapper rising before dawn in winter did not merely ask whether he felt warm enough to continue. He read the air, the snow surface, the shape of the clouds, the direction of the wind, the behavior of his own breathing, the stiffness in his clothing from the previous night, the fuel available, the distance to timber, the exposure ahead, the condition of animals, the slope of the land, and the cost of delay. A cold day was not one thing. It was a set of changing relationships. To move safely through it, a man had to think ahead of his body. That is one of the first sharp differences between modern cold exposure and historical cold survival. Today, people often experience winter as a series of short entries into discomfort: a parking lot, a ski run, a hike, a stalled car, a brief power failure. Even people who love the outdoors often do so within a larger net of rescue, forecasting, communication, mapped routes, and relatively quick return to shelter. That does not mean modern people are soft. It means the structure around their lives changes what they have to know. When exposure is temporary, knowledge can remain partial. When exposure is a condition of life, partial knowledge is not enough. It is tempting to answer this by saying, the mountain men were simply more used to the cold. That is true, but it is not complete. People can be used to hard conditions and still fail in them. What made repeated exposure valuable was not some vague hardening of spirit. It trained attention. It taught them to notice the point at which effort became danger. It taught them how quickly wet clothing could turn on the body once activity slowed. It taught them that the line between feeling warm and becoming unsafe was often crossed during work, not rest. It taught them that winter punished wasted motion, poor timing, false economy, and impatience. Modern cold weather advertising has quietly trained many people into the opposite outlook. It presents winter as a technical problem solved by buying the correct system. Wear the right shell. Use the right insulation. Trust the rating. Pack the device. Choose the branded protection. None of this is foolish by itself. Good gear matters. Materials have improved in real ways. A modern waterproof layer or sleeping system can offer protection beyond what many earlier travelers possessed. But the sales logic underneath those objects carries a hidden message. It teaches that safety can be carried on the body like a product, as if cold were mostly a matter of external resistance. The old winter travelers understood something harsher and more useful. Protection was never just what you wore. It was how you moved, when you stopped, what you noticed, what you refused to ignore, how well you managed your own heat, and whether your habits matched the land you were crossing. Imagine, for a moment, two people approaching the same high basin as afternoon light begins to thin. The first is modern, fit, well-equipped, and confident. The pack is expensive. The fabrics breathe. The boots are rated for bitter temperatures. The weather app in the morning looked manageable. The second is a mountain man of the fur trade era, carrying less by modern standards, wearing natural materials, and moving through the same basin with no thought that an object alone will save him. The first person may already be in quiet trouble without knowing it. He climbed hard in the earlier miles, grew hot, sweated into base layers, then slowed with the belief that insulation would hold everything steady. The second man likely avoided sweating hard in the first place, or adjusted sooner, because he knows that trapped dampness is a debt that comes due later. That single difference matters more than it first appears. Cold weather can produce a strange betrayal. The greatest danger often begins when a person feels temporarily comfortable. Climb too hard, and the body pours out heat. Clothing that was meant to save you becomes a chamber that holds moisture close. Then, the pace drops. Wind finds the damp cloth, the surface temperature changes. Muscles cool. Hands stiffen. Judgment narrows. What seemed like warmth was only heat wasted too fast. A person who reads winter poorly keeps asking, "Am I cold right now?" A person who reads it well asks, "What am I becoming in the next half hour?" This is one reason mountain men sometimes appear superhuman in later memory. They made choices that do not look dramatic from the outside, yet those choices preserved life. They slowed before they sweated too much. They paid attention to exposure. They watched terrain for shelter, not scenery. They kept an eye on wood, water, animals, and distance. They did not wait for cold to become a crisis before adjusting. And because so much of this knowledge sat inside daily behavior, later generations looking backward often failed to see it. The achievements remained visible. The thinking behind them faded. There is another misunderstanding that comes from the way modern people talk about harsh conditions. We often treat hardship as a kind of test event. Something begins, reaches a peak, and ends. A blizzard, a survival story, a terrible night. But for the men living and trapping across the interior West, winter was not a dramatic episode inserted into life. It was the medium through which life was lived for long stretches. That changes everything. When harshness is continuous, people stop organizing their behavior around moments of bravery. They organize around conservation, prediction, and repeated small correctness. The goal is not to have one heroic night. The goal is to avoid creating one. That mindset can seem less exciting, but it was far more reliable. A modern person in trouble may suddenly become highly motivated, even disciplined, once danger is obvious. But winter often punishes the errors made before motivation rises. The wrong route, the delayed camp, the soaked layer, the skipped meal, the misplaced gloves, the assumption that the crossing would be quick, the decision to sit down after sweating hard, the choice to keep pushing through fading light instead of preparing while there is still enough warmth to work efficiently. Cold strips away the grace period between error and consequence. The mountain men knew this through habit, but also through witness. Frontier life was filled with stories of exposure, frostbite, lost horses, frozen camps, failed crossings, and men caught out at the wrong hour with the wrong level of fatigue. The record does not show a population untouched by winter's violence. Quite the opposite. It shows a world in which survival depended on reading danger early enough to stay ahead of it. Some men became skilled at that reading. Others paid dearly for getting it wrong. The West did not produce cold wisdom automatically. It selected for it. Even the phrase, "better gear," deserves a second look. Better for what exactly? Better for warmth while standing still? Better for dry snow or wet snow? Better for low exertion or steep effort? Better for planned rest or sudden emergency? Better for a person who already knows how to regulate body heat or one who assumes the garment can do the thinking for him? A modern parka may be vastly better than an old wool outer layer in one narrow sense, but if it encourages the wearer to mismanage heat and moisture, then better begins to split into two meanings. Technically, superior material can coexist with inferior judgment. The old trappers lived much closer to the second meaning. Their clothing systems, varied and imperfect as they were, had to function inside a broader pattern of action. Buckskin, wool, blankets, leggings, fur caps, moccasins with adjustments for season and ground, robes, fire use, shelter choice, and travel timing all formed part of one living arrangement. No single piece can be pulled out and judged in isolation. Modern comparisons often fail because they compare object to object instead of system to system. But winter does not evaluate objects. It evaluates systems. That point becomes clearer when we think about what a cold day actually asks from a body. The body is always balancing production and loss. It makes heat through metabolism and movement. It loses heat through wind, moisture, contact, and stillness. The simplest looking actions can tip that balance fast. Sit on frozen ground without insulation, and heat drains into the surface. Walk too hard in heavy clothing and sweat begins to load the layers. Breathe hard in dry cold and water loss increases. Skip food and the body's engine weakens. Neglect hands or feet, and useful movement starts to disappear at the edges. Survival in winter is not merely about carrying warmth. It is about managing exchange. And that is where the mountain men often held the real edge. They lived closer to exchange. They did not think of cold as a single number, the way a forecast does. They encountered it through the body and land together. Snow texture told them something. Wind line told them something. Animal movement told them something. Tree cover, slope angle, creek edges, cloud thickness, morning crust, and evening stillness all told them something. Their survival came not from ignorance of danger, but from intimacy with these signals. To many modern people, this can sound romantic, which is unfortunate, because romance makes the subject vague. There was nothing soft or dreamy about learning from winter the hard way. The lessons were expensive. Cold injuries could last a lifetime. Hunger and fatigue sharpened every mistake. Bad luck remained real. Yet within that severe environment, some men built a practical intelligence that no catalog can sell. They learned how to prevent crisis by living in constant negotiation with conditions. There is a lesson buried in that which runs against modern instinct. We often assume that comfort is proof of safety. If the gear feels warm, if the body feels cushioned, if there is no immediate suffering, then all seems well. But winter does not always work that way. Comfort can mask a brewing problem. A person can be very comfortable while walking too hard, wearing too much, drinking too little, eating too late, or letting daylight slip away. The mountain men were far less likely to confuse current comfort with future safety. Their lives pushed them to ask harder questions. Can I keep this dry? Can I stop here and still wake ready to move? Is there enough fuel? Is the basin about to trap wind after sunset? If I cross now, what happens if I am delayed on the far side? They lived farther forward in time. That may be the first real answer to the title's puzzle. Better gear did not automatically make modern people worse in the cold. It made it easier to stop paying attention in the old way. It widened the distance between body and environment. It allowed more people to enter severe conditions without years of learning, which is a triumph in one sense and a danger in another. The tools improved, the habits often thinned out. We gained material protection while losing some of the fine-grained awareness that earlier winter travelers treated as basic. You can see this in simple modern mistakes. Someone wears thick gloves, so they ignore how little they are using their fingers until fine control disappears. Someone trusts waterproof boots, so they fail to manage heat and moisture inside them. Someone carries a highly rated sleeping bag, so they do not think enough about ground insulation, camp placement, wind exposure, or the calories needed to sleep warm. Someone has a jacket meant for bitter temperatures, so they climb in it, sweat hard, and create a damp inner climate that later turns into cold stress. Again and again, the problem is not the object. It is the way the object alters judgment. The mountain men, for all their limitations, were not usually free to indulge that altered judgment. If they made camp poorly, the night would teach them. If they failed to protect dry material, morning would teach them. If they chose speed over sweat control, the next halt would teach them. If they neglected food before cold rest, the body would answer. Their education was relentless, and because it was relentless, it moved past theory into instinct. We should be careful not to flatten them into perfect winter machines. Many suffered badly. Some died. Some made terrible errors, took foolish risks, or got trapped by conditions beyond their control. Frontier life did not produce a neat class of winter masters, but among those who endured repeatedly, there grew a kind of intelligence that is easy to overlook precisely because it does not sound glamorous. It lived in pacing, timing, restraint, preparation, and observation. It lived in refusing to let the body drift too far from what the weather demanded. One reason this matters now is that modern people often imagine knowledge as something spoken clearly in rules. Wear this. Avoid that. Bring extra layers. Stay dry. Build shelter before dark. Those rules are sound as far as they go. But the old mountain men worked with a deeper kind of knowing. It was not merely that staying dry mattered. It was how dry related to effort, fabric, time of day, wind exposure, fuel access, and the coming stop. It was not merely that shelter mattered. It was where shelter sat in relation to drift, timber, hidden dampness, airflow, water, animals, and the work required to prepare it while hands still functioned well. Their knowledge was alive because the world around them never stopped moving. That living quality is what modern equipment can never replace. A jacket cannot sense for you. A boot cannot judge pace. A sleeping bag cannot decide when to stop. A weather forecast cannot tell you how your own sweat has changed your margin. Even the best tools still depend on a user who reads conditions well. The mountain men survived better in the cold not because their world was easier, nor because their clothing was secretly superior in every technical way, but because they understood that winter is a conversation with consequence. If you stop listening, the land keeps speaking anyway. And the first place that conversation becomes audible is not in a blizzard, not in a dramatic collapse, not in some final desperate hour, but in the small mistakes made while everything still seems manageable. A coat left closed a little too long on the uphill push. A delayed meal. A camp chosen for convenience instead of protection. A false belief that warmth now means safety later. A trust in gear strong enough to mute the body's warnings. This is how severe cold often enters a life. Quietly, politely, with no need to frighten you at first. The old trappers knew better than to wait for fear. They learned to act before fear was necessary. That is not the kind of lesson a person buys. It is the kind that forms when winter is not an occasional challenge but a long teacher. And once we begin to see that, the whole image of the mountain man starts to change. He becomes less a figure of raw hardship and more a technician of exposure, a reader of terrain and timing, a person whose survival depended on recognizing patterns most of us no longer have to notice. The gear mattered, yes, but the deeper advantage sat elsewhere, in a trained relationship with cold that modern life rarely asks us to develop. To understand that relationship, we have to leave behind the comforting idea that old survival was just toughness wrapped in fur. We have to enter the country they moved through, the rhythm of their days, the kind of winter that did not arrive as an event, but as a world. Only there does their knowledge start to make full sense. Only there can we see why the cold, which looks simple from a distance, was read by them almost like a language. Winter, on the western frontier, did not arrive as a season in the modern sense, something marked neatly on a calendar and softened by routine shelter. It arrived as a force that altered distance, labor, sleep, hunger, travel, and time itself. A river crossing that was merely difficult in autumn could become a place of real decision in deep cold. A ridge that looked passable under clear sky could turn punishing once wind found it. A camp that seemed acceptable at dusk could reveal its flaws when the temperature dropped harder after midnight. The mountain men lived inside those changes for long stretches, not as visitors but as working bodies tied to them day after day. That constant exposure shaped the way they thought, long before it shaped the way they looked. The popular picture of the mountain man often shows a single figure, moving alone through snow with rifle, pack, and fur hat, as if his life consisted mostly of dramatic wandering. The truth was both more ordinary and more demanding. Much of his existence was built from repeated labor. Riding, walking, setting traps, checking lines, scraping hides, drying gear, finding fuel, managing animals, repairing equipment, watching weather, securing food, and choosing ground for the next halt. The work never stood apart from the climate. Every task carried a thermal cost. Every delay had a bodily meaning. Even stillness had to be earned carefully. In that world, there was no clean division between daily life and cold survival. They were the same thing. That is one reason the old trappers developed a relationship with winter that feels almost foreign now. Most modern people enter cold conditions from the outside. They prepare for them, step into them, and later step back out. The mountain men had no such firm boundary. Cold was not a temporary opponent faced during recreation or emergency. It was part of the architecture of their working lives. It decided how far a man could travel before dark, how long hands could remain useful in camp tasks, whether a horse needed immediate care, whether a stream edge could be trusted, whether fuel had to be collected before anything else, whether the body could afford to rest, and whether the next morning would begin with strength or weakness. When a condition rules that many parts of life, people stop treating it as one more problem. They begin organizing themselves around it. Much of this world was shaped by geography. The fur trade frontier stretched across immense country, and that country was never one simple environment. There were high basins where air sharpened and nights dropped fast after sunset. There were wooded valleys where shelter existed but movement slowed. There were open plains where wind could take a moderate temperature and turn it into a serious danger. There were streams and marshy ground that chilled feet long before true winter had fully settled in. There were mountain passes where snow did not merely cover the land, but changed the meaning of travel itself. There were camps near timber and camps where fuel was scarce enough to become a central question before evening even began. A man moving through that range of places could not survive on a single fixed habit. He had to keep adjusting. That adjustment began with the pace of life. Modern people often underestimate how much cold survival depends on time, not just temperature. A winter day has its own rhythm. Morning can feel brutal but workable once movement starts. Midday may tempt overexertion. Afternoon closes faster than expected when light angles lower. Evening can turn small delays into major errors. The mountain men lived close to that rhythm because they had to. They knew that a task delayed in winter does not remain the same task. Collecting fuel late is not the same as collecting it early. Crossing a stream after the body is tired is not the same as crossing it with daylight and heat still available. Choosing camp at the last possible moment is not the same as choosing it while hands are still nimble and judgment still broad. The world of cold punishes lateness in a way warmer environments often do not. This shaped their mornings in quiet ways. Rising was not simply a matter of waking and beginning the day. It involved reopening the body to labor after a night of guarded heat. A man had to assess his stiffness, his clothing, the condition of his bedding or robe, the state of the fire if there had been one, the weather outside the shelter, the feel of the air, and the prospects of movement. If boots had grown hard, if moccasins needed attention, if garments held dampness from the previous day, if horses or mules required immediate care, the morning began under pressure. A modern person who spends 1 or 2 nights out in winter may remember the beauty of frost and the silence before dawn. The mountain men knew that hour as a negotiation. Before the day could even open, the body had to be managed back into usefulness. Animals made that negotiation more complex. Horses and mules were not simply companions or transport. They were moving responsibilities. Their condition mattered constantly. A weakened animal could slow travel, limit options, threaten supplies, or trap a man in a bad place. Feeding, watering, protecting, and watching them became part of the cold system. Snow cover affected grazing. Ice affected access to water. Bitter nights affected strength. Theft, wandering, injury, and weather could all turn an animal from advantage into source of anxiety. A man traveling with stock in winter was not merely preserving his own warmth, he was protecting a broader circle of survival. And because animals consume time and attention, they also shaped the human day. Camp choices, route choices, and stopping times all had to account for them. Food mattered in the same steady way. The romantic image of the frontier often prizes courage and hardiness, but bodies do not run on myth. Cold asks for fuel. Travel asks for fuel. Recovery asks for fuel. A man living through winter in trapping country needed calories, and securing those calories could not be assumed. Hunting might succeed or fail. Supplies might run low. Game might be scarce in a given stretch. A body underfed in severe conditions loses more than comfort. It loses resilience. It produces less heat. It recovers more slowly. It makes poorer decisions. This is another area where constant exposure educated the mountain men. Hunger and cold were never separate. They reinforced each other. A tired man with thin food is not simply less satisfied. He is less capable of staying warm through the next phase of work or the next long night. That connection between cold and nourishment shaped behavior in subtle ways. It influenced whether a man pushed on or stopped sooner. It affected how much labor he could safely spend gathering fuel or improving camp. It altered how hard he could climb without overtaxing himself. It even changed the body's feeling of the environment. 2 people can stand in the same temperature and not inhabit the same winter. The fed body and the depleted body experience different margins. The mountain men learned this not from charts, but from consequence. A poor food day was also a cold risk. A successful hunt or a preserved store of meat did more than satisfy hunger. It widened the body's room to endure. The same was true of shelter, though shelter in their world often meant something far less complete than what modern people imagine. There were cabins in some places and trading posts in others, but much of the time shelter was provisional. Lean-tos, skin lodges, blanket arrangements, natural windbreaks, timber cover, hollows, rough structures, camps improved by labor rather than architecture. Warmth in such places was not produced by walls alone. It came from placement, ground treatment, fire, dryness, and how efficiently the body could use what little protection existed. A poor shelter choice could magnify the night. A good one could turn a threatening evening into a manageable rest. Once again, the advantage came less from possessing a single ideal solution than from recognizing which solution fit the ground at hand. This is where their intimacy with place becomes important. The mountain men did not move through generic winter. They moved through known valleys, known river bends, known timber belts, known exposures, known danger points. Over time, repeated travel turned country into memory. One slope held snow differently than another. One creek bottom gathered colder air after dark. One stretch of timber offered better fuel. One basin trapped weather. One opening allowed wind to cut hard after sunset. That local memory made survival more efficient. A man who knows where cold settles, where wood can be found quickly, where water remains accessible, and where animals can be protected has already reduced his risk before the night begins. This is not the same as toughness. It is orientation. Orientation changed the emotional experience of winter too. Cold becomes more frightening when it feels random. When a person does not understand what the land is doing, every change feels larger. A sudden gust, a deepening gray sky, a frozen edge along a stream, a horse growing restless, snow underfoot changing from dry to wet, all can seem like disconnected threats. But for someone who has lived in a region long enough, those signals belong to patterns. The weather is still dangerous, but it is less mysterious. That matters because panic and confusion burn judgment. The mountain men who endured repeatedly were not free from fear. They were simply less likely to be surprised by the kinds of things winter does when it begins to turn. The frontier also taught them that movement itself had to be disciplined. In modern life, effort is often praised without much qualification. Push harder, move faster, cover ground, finish the route. Winter travel can punish that ethic. In many situations, the most dangerous traveler is not the weakest, but the one who wastes heat through badly timed exertion. A mountain man learned to think about motion in relation to terrain, moisture, wind, daylight, and the labor still waiting at camp. There was no point arriving in a promising place at dusk soaked with sweat and too spent to gather wood or improve shelter. There was no point crossing difficult country quickly if the speed consumed tomorrow's strength. The day had to be paced as a whole, not conquered moment by moment. This also helps explain why life in that world educated the senses so thoroughly. Cold training was not a separate lesson. It happened while men worked, traveled, ate, repaired, hunted, watched animals, and slept. The body kept receiving information, fingers stiffening in a certain wind, leather changing feel after moisture, snow squeaking differently at lower temperatures, breath catching more sharply in certain morning air, timber burning one way when properly dry and another when not, ice thickness varying near current, feet warming during movement, then threatening trouble once stopped. All of these became part of an ordinary mental library. Repetition turned details into warnings, and warnings into instinct. The mountain men were also shaped by the social structure of their world, even when they traveled alone for periods. Knowledge moved along lines of apprenticeship, observation, trade, and shared hardship. A younger or less experienced man did not enter the winter country empty. He watched others. He heard stories of failure. He absorbed practices from native communities, from older trappers, from guides, from camp companions, and from repeated experience. This mattered enormously. Frontier knowledge was not the property of one heroic individual standing apart from others. It was part of a rough culture of adaptation, assembled from many sources. Clothing methods, route choices, camp habits, use of robes, handling of moccasins or leggings, reading of weather, and food practices did not arise out of nowhere. They were learned, borrowed, adjusted, and tested against conditions. That point is especially important because the mountain men did not invent all of the cold wisdom associated with them. Much of what worked in the interior West had been known far longer by native peoples who had lived with those climates and landscapes across generations. Skills of movement, shelter use, clothing adaptation, food handling, route awareness, and seasonal understanding came from older systems of life, already rooted in the land. The fur trade world was a meeting ground of many traditions, and men who survived well often did so because they learned from those who understood the country more deeply than they did at first. This makes the story more real and more interesting. Survival knowledge was not some magical trait of frontier masculinity. It was practical intelligence transmitted through contact, necessity, and humility before the land. Their working year reinforced this learning. The beaver trade, travel to rendezvous, movement between valleys, seasonal changes in water and animal patterns, and the demands of long-distance travel all forced men into repeated contact with shifting conditions. The winter country was not a static white backdrop. It was a changing field of opportunities and limits. Some routes closed, others opened. Frozen surfaces could help one week and betray the next. Timber mattered differently in one stretch than in another. Animal condition changed as the season deepened. Snow cover altered the work of traps, travel, and hunting. A man who hoped to keep functioning had to remain responsive. Life could not be arranged once and then left alone. From that came a mindset that modern people often find difficult to sustain because our environments rarely insist on it. The mountain men learned to think in margins. Not in absolutes, but in degrees of safety and risk. Enough light left to improve camp, or not enough. Enough fuel gathered for the night, or not enough. Enough dryness in the clothing to stop safely, or not enough. Enough food to recover, or not enough. Enough shelter from wind to rest, or not enough. Their world sharpened the habit of asking not whether something was possible, but whether it remained wise once the next few hours were included in the calculation. This habit extended even into rest. Modern people often picture stopping as relief, the obvious reward after exertion. In winter, stopping can be one of the more dangerous transitions of the day. The body cools. Dampness asserts itself. Fine motor skills fade. Darkness gathers. The work not yet done becomes harder just when energy begins to drop. The mountain men knew this because stopping was part of their labor, not a simple absence of it. Camp was not leisure. Camp was another phase of survival. Wood had to be found, bedding arranged, animals handled, wet items managed, food prepared or rationed, fire maintained if one was possible. Rest itself only became restorative when those surrounding tasks had been handled well enough. This is another difference from modern cold exposure, where stopping often means returning to a warmed interior that someone else built and powers. Even the emotional texture of their world deserves attention. Severe winter country can narrow the mind if a person lets it. Repetitive strain, isolation, hunger, cold discomfort, long silence, and uncertain weather can lead to bad decisions, not because the person lacks courage, but because the body and mind become less generous. Irritation rises. Shortcuts grow attractive. One delay feels larger than it really is. The mountain men were not immune to this. But because cold and labor were constant, their emotional discipline also became part of survival. Patience mattered. So did restraint. So did the ability to avoid spending too much anger or energy on what could not be controlled. A man who cursed the weather gained nothing. A man who adjusted to it preserved options. There is a powerful modern tendency to think of adaptation as something physical alone. Better circulation, greater tolerance, tougher skin, stronger will. Yet one of the real adaptations frontier winter demanded was moral in the quiet sense of the word. It required habits of mind, acceptance of limits, willingness to do unglamorous work at the right moment, ability to prepare before comfort demanded action, refusal to treat nature like a machine that should obey intention. The mountain men who endured learned not only how to keep warm, but how to submit their timing to conditions. That kind of submission is hard for modern people because we are trained to expect control. Control was always partial in that world. A trapper might read the day well and still suffer. Storms did not respect skill perfectly. Injury could ruin a careful plan. Lost animals, broken gear, thin food, sudden thaw, frozen crossing, or plain bad luck could throw a man into danger quickly. But repeated winter living still produced a crucial gain. It reduced the number of avoidable mistakes, and in severe conditions, removing avoidable mistakes is often the difference between hardship and disaster. This helps explain why their knowledge often went unseen by later observers. There is a bias in storytelling toward dramatic acts: a desperate fire, a blizzard shelter, a near-death escape. These make for memorable scenes. What matters just as much, and often more, is all the trouble that never arrived because somebody stopped early, changed layers in time, chose the lee side of timber, gathered more fuel than seemed necessary, ate before exhaustion deepened, slowed before sweat, soaked the inner clothing, or chose not to cross one more drainage in fading light. The mountain men lived by those preventive decisions so often that the pattern became part of their character. Later generations, looking only at the visible hardships, mistook discipline for natural toughness. Their material world also pressed them toward awareness because so much of it demanded maintenance. Clothing was not a sealed miracle. Leather needed care. Wool held value, but also limits. Fire-starting materials had to be protected. Weapons and tools had to function in cold. Bedding and robes had to remain useful. Packs and saddles had to keep working. A modern traveler often treats gear as a finished answer purchased in a store. The mountain men lived with gear as part of an ongoing relationship. It wore, stiffened, dampened, cracked, loosened, failed, and required attention. That alone changed the psychology of survival. When equipment is visibly vulnerable, a person is less likely to place blind faith in it. The land taught them another lesson that has almost disappeared in many modern settings. Shelter is not a place, but a process. A person can occupy a structure and still be badly sheltered if wind, moisture, fuel, or ground loss are not managed. By contrast, a person with limited materials can create relative shelter through placement and labor. The mountain men did not assume that camp meant safety. Camp had to be made safe enough through judgment. This way of thinking turns every stop into an assessment. What is the ground doing? Where will the air move after dark? What hidden dampness sits near this inviting spot? How far is wood? Is there cover overhead? What will happen if weather changes at midnight? Their winter world rewarded those who could ask these questions while they still had the strength to answer them. That same process applied to routes. A line on the land could not be judged only by distance. It had to be judged by what it demanded from the body. Open ground might be faster, but more exposed. Timber might offer cover, but slow movement. A frozen stretch might save time or destroy it if the surface failed. A descent late in the day might cost precious warmth and control. The map in a modern head often prioritizes efficient arrival. The map in a winter traveler's head must prioritize sustainable arrival. Mountain men who stayed alive learned to read routes as sequences of consequences. By living in this way, they also came to know that winter was never fully defeated. That recognition is easy to miss because modern culture loves stories of mastery. But their survival came partly from the opposite impulse. They did not expect complete victory over the environment. They expected negotiation. They expected exposure. They expected discomfort. They expected the need to adjust. That lowered the chance of surprise and with it the chance of denial. Modern people often get into trouble because they continue acting as if the original plan still deserves loyalty after conditions have changed. The frontier winter trained people away from that habit. Pride had less value than adaptation. All of this made their world slower in some ways, but also sharper. Slower, because every movement had to include tomorrow and the next cold hour, not just immediate desire. Sharper, because consequence stayed close. A modern inconvenience often remains just that. A frontier inconvenience in winter could cascade. Wet feet became reduced movement, delayed camp. Delayed camp reduced shelter quality. Poor shelter deepened fatigue. Fatigue weakened judgment the next day. Their world linked small failures together so tightly that paying attention was not a virtue in the abstract. It was a practical form of self-preservation. Once that world is seen clearly, the old image of the mountain man begins to shift again. He is not merely a rugged figure dressed for weather. He is a worker shaped by repeated exposure, local memory, food uncertainty, animal care, physical labor, borrowed knowledge, seasonal timing, and constant decision under conditions that offered little forgiveness. His real environment was not just cold air. It was the whole network around that air: the fuel, the terrain, the body, the hunger, the animals, the darkness, the ground, the wetness, the next morning, and the small disciplines that kept all of them from collapsing into one another. That was the world they lived in, and it explains why their understanding ran so deep. Cold was not a topic for them. It was not an occasional challenge, not a controlled exercise, not a weekend identity. It was embedded in routine. Because it sat inside routine, they learned things modern people can still struggle to grasp, even with superior materials. They learned that winter is made of systems. They learned that the body must be managed before it feels endangered. They learned that a man can ruin a night in the last hour of daylight without noticing it. They learned that warmth depends on many decisions that begin long before darkness falls. They learned that the land is always giving information, though often in forms too plain to impress anyone who has not needed them for survival. And from that long schooling came the next layer of their advantage. It was not enough to live in cold country. Many did, and not all handled it well. The deeper edge appeared in what they actually did with this knowledge once the day was underway: how they dressed, moved, sweated, stopped, dried, warmed, and preserved strength. Their survival became most visible not in grand moments, but in technique. The methods themselves were quiet, often plain to look at, and easy for later generations to underestimate. Yet inside those methods lay much of the difference between enduring winter and being slowly beaten by it. The advantage of the mountain men did not live in one secret trick, one miraculous garment, or one forgotten ritual that solved winter all at once. It lived in a chain of methods, each one modest on its own, but powerful when linked together across a full day of exposure. That is part of why their knowledge can look unimpressive from a distance. The old practices rarely arrive wrapped in drama. They appear instead as timing, restraint, adjustment, and repetition. A man changes pace before he is in trouble. He opens or closes clothing before discomfort becomes obvious. He notices moisture before it has turned dangerous. He chooses where to stop with the night already in mind. He protects the parts of tomorrow that have not happened yet. None of that makes for a loud legend. Yet those plain acts often decide whether winter remains manageable or starts taking things away. One of the clearest differences lay in the way they thought about clothing. Modern people often think first in terms of insulation. How warm is the coat? How thick are the gloves? What temperature is the boot rated for? Those questions matter, but they do not go deep enough. The mountain men understood clothing less as a static barrier and more as a moving system. The point was not to feel as warm as possible at every instant. The point was to keep the body within a workable range through effort, rest, wind, dampness, and falling light. That is a very different target. A person aiming only for immediate warmth may overdress, sweat, and later pay for it. A person aiming for control must think in stages, warm enough to function, dry enough to remain safe, flexible enough to adjust, protected enough to stop without collapse. Natural materials played a central role in that older system. Wool, hide, fur, and various layered textiles each had strengths and weaknesses. None were magical. Wool could hold warmth even when damp, which made it precious. Hide and buckskin could be tough and practical, yet their performance shifted with wetness and drying. Fur offered exceptional value in certain conditions, especially when matched to the right task. Blankets and robes could become portable shelter as much as clothing. What matters here is not the exact inventory of garments one man carried compared with another. What matters is how these materials were used with awareness. The old winter travelers knew clothing had to serve movement, labor, and stopping in sequence. A heavy outer layer that felt wonderful, while still could be a liability during hard climbing. A garment that shielded against wind could trap too much heat during exertion. A man who survived repeatedly learned not to confuse a useful garment with a universally useful one. This is where the old knowledge starts to feel sharper than modern instinct. The danger in cold often begins during effort, not in stillness. That sounds backward because people imagine hypothermia as something that attacks while the body is already frozen and desperate. But mountain men knew the problem often starts earlier, in the hours when the body is active enough to generate plenty of heat. Walk hard uphill in full winter gear, and the body becomes a furnace. The skin dampens. Inner layers collect moisture. Breath deepens. The person feels alive, warm, strong, even pleased by the efficiency of the pace. Yet beneath that feeling, something costly is happening. Heat is being spent too freely, and water is being laid into the clothing system. The true danger arrives later, when effort drops, wind rises, light fades, and all that dampness begins helping the cold instead of resisting it. The mountain men manage this by treating sweat almost like an approaching enemy, not because sweating was always avoidable, but because they knew excess moisture could undo the day. They were far more likely to regulate effort before sweat became heavy. They loosened layers earlier. They accepted a cooler feeling during movement, if it preserved safety later. This is one of the hardest lessons for modern people to absorb, because it runs against comfort. To move well in cold weather often means choosing slight chill over pleasant overheating. The mountain man who understood winter did not ask, "How do I feel right now?" in the narrow sense. He asked something closer to, "What am I building inside my clothing, and what will it cost me when I stop?" This awareness extended to the skin, the chest, the back, the hands, and especially the feet. Feet sit at the center of winter survival more often than heroic stories admit. A person may tolerate cold hands for a while. He may endure facial sting, stiff legs, and numb ears. But once the feet begin to fail, movement itself starts shrinking. Balance changes. Confidence changes. Distance changes. Camp work grows harder. Route choices narrow. The mountain men understood that foot management was not just a comfort issue but a survival priority. Moccasins, leggings, liners, wrappings, spare dry material when available, attention to wet ground, attention to snow condition, attention to stopping time, all of this mattered. A modern boot may outperform an older system in certain ways. Yet if the wearer neglects moisture inside it or assumes that thickness solves everything, trouble can still gather. Winter punishes the false sense of security that comes from sealed systems. A boot may keep outside moisture away while trapping inner dampness if the person moves too hard or fails to dry what can be dried. The mountain men lived with fewer illusions. Their materials often made wear, wetness, and failure more obvious. That was a disadvantage in one sense, but an advantage in another. When gear visibly changes, people respond sooner. When gear looks invincible, people often respond later. Old winter travelers learned to inspect, adjust, and maintain constantly because they had no reason to believe that yesterday's dryness or warmth would continue without help. Another difference lay in the way they handled transition moments. Most danger in winter does not come from one condition alone. It comes from shifts, from movement to rest, from daylight to dusk, from dry snow to wet footing, from sheltered timber to exposed ridge, from a full stomach to a long, hungry stretch, from one side of a stream to the other. The mountain men seem to have been especially alert during such transitions. They knew that stopping after a hard push was not a neutral act. It was the moment when hidden moisture, exposed skin, and slowing circulation could begin changing the body rapidly. A modern person often treats stopping as relief and thinks first about comfort. The older winter traveler treated stopping as another problem to manage well. That meant certain actions came fast when camp or temporary rest began, not because the men were frantic, but because they understood sequence. Fuel first, before fingers lost too much, fine control. Protection from wind early, before the body cooled too sharply. Damp items attended to, while heat still remained from movement. Bedding, robe, blanket, or insulating arrangement prepared before exhaustion became overwhelming. Animals handled before darkness complicated everything further. Food started or rationed in time for the body to use it. Fire, if possible, given the right kind of attention rather than vague hope. In all these cases, the principle was the same. Winter rewards a person who acts while still somewhat strong, not one who waits until necessity becomes obvious. Fire itself deserves a more careful look because later memory often turns it into a simple solution. Light a fire and you are safe. Fail to light one and you are doomed. Reality was more exacting. Fire mattered enormously, but not as a magical answer. It had to be placed, fed, protected, and used wisely. Wet fuel, poor location, bad wind exposure, wasted sparks, rushed construction, or lack of preparation could make a fire weak when strength was needed most. The mountain men understood this not as wilderness theater, but as plain labor. Fire was heat, drying power, morale, cooking, and a margin against the night. Yet, it was also a system dependent on wood condition, quantity, weather, time, and effort. They learned to think about fuel before the flames were needed. That is one of the clearest examples of the mountain men's practical edge. They gathered ahead of fear. Modern people often begin taking conditions seriously only after discomfort has grown sharp. The older winter travelers had reason to reverse that order. A man who waits to gather enough wood until he is already thoroughly chilled is forcing his body to perform at the very moment performance is dropping. A man who improves camp while he still has heat left from movement is spending energy more intelligently. The same principle applied to nearly everything. Prepare before desperation, dry before freezing, stop before collapse, eat before weakness deepens, adjust before numbness becomes serious. Their method was anticipatory, not reactive. Shelter technique followed the same logic. A simple windbreak could matter more than a technically warmer arrangement exposed to moving air. Ground insulation could matter more than overhead cover in certain conditions. A slight change in location could mean a calmer night, drier footing, better fuel access, or less trouble with drifting snow. The mountain men knew how to use what was present rather than longing for what was absent. A fold in the land, a belt of timber, a bank, a thicket, a stand of trees broken from the main wind, all could become part of the shelter system if read correctly. Their skill was not built on ideal campsites appearing on command. It was built on recognizing relative advantage in imperfect ground. That relative thinking shaped how they slept as well. Sleep in severe cold is never merely rest. It is a wager on the quality of preparation. Modern people used to insulated pads, sealed sleeping bags, stable tents, and predictable campsites can underestimate how much old winter sleep depended on managing layers, ground contact, moisture, fire, food, and body position together. Robes, blankets, bough beds when available, raised material, placement near but not too near fire, wind protection, and careful use of dry layers all played a role. The mountain men were not enjoying luxurious nights under primitive romance. They were arranging enough retained heat and enough protection from loss to keep recovery possible. That is a humbler, more demanding art. Food and drink entered this method constantly. The body in cold is not a machine that can be ordered to stay warm by will alone. It needs input. Mountain men understood, even if not in modern scientific language, that strength, recovery, and warmth were tied to nourishment. A man low on food might still move for a time, but his margin would narrow. That meant food strategy was part of winter technique, not an unrelated concern. A person who reaches camp exhausted and underfed may struggle not only because he is tired, but because his body no longer answers the cold with the same force. The old trappers saw that through repeated consequence. A hot meal, a ration used at the right time, preserved fat, meat, or anything that restored energy, could change the feel of the next hours substantially. The issue was not indulgence. It was operational heat. Water mattered too, though winter can trick people into neglecting it. Cold often suppresses the feeling of thirst, especially when the air is dry and the body is working. Yet dehydration weakens judgment and bodily performance. The mountain men may not have discussed it in the terms we do now, but they knew that a dry, overworked body handles exposure poorly. Snow itself is not easy comfort. It must be melted, managed, and not relied upon carelessly in ways that steal heat or time. Water in winter is always connected to labor. Finding it, thawing it, carrying it, preventing freezing, using fuel to prepare it, all cost something. Men who survived well learned to account for those costs early. Movement strategy formed another major advantage. Modern people often imagine survival travel as a contest of endurance. Keep pushing, keep covering ground, keep fighting conditions. The mountain men often thought more economically. Movement had to be matched to terrain, weather, body state, and what remained to be done afterward. A fast push at the wrong time could ruin camp readiness. A badly timed crossing could soak feet or clothing too late in the day. A strenuous climb in full insulation could produce dangerous dampness. A route that looked shorter on open ground might expose the body far more than a slightly longer line through cover. Winter does not judge motion by distance gained. It judges motion by net consequence. This is one reason older winter travelers often seemed less hurried than modern people expect. Slowing was not weakness when it prevented a larger loss. Stopping early was not failure when it preserved the next day. Taking time to dry, adjust, or gather more fuel than seemed immediately necessary was not needless delay. It was disciplined accounting. A mountain man could not afford the pride of pretending that the body's costs did not matter. He lived too close to consequence. Modern people, backed by rescue possibilities and by gear that can mask smaller errors, often retain more room for stubbornness. That room can be dangerous. The hands were another frontier of technique. Hands are both tools and warning devices. Once fine control slips, many essential tasks become slower or clumsier. Striking sparks, tying, cutting, adjusting clothing, handling small objects, loading or repairing gear, preparing food, managing tack, or working with wet materials. The mountain men learned to protect hand function before they desperately needed it. Gloves, mitts, warming methods, timing, and task sequencing all mattered. It was often wiser to complete delicate or important work early, while hands still obeyed quickly, than to delay until cold and fatigue turned each motion into friction. That is another small discipline later generations easily miss. The body must be used while it remains most useful. Timing shelter work before dark mattered in the same way. Winter shortens the margin for correction. A mistake made at noon can sometimes be repaired. A mistake made in the last thinning light may not be. The mountain men understood dusk not simply as a visual change, but as a compression of options. Wood becomes harder to judge and gather. Ground becomes harder to read. Distances feel different. Temperature often begins another downward movement. Weariness accumulates. Animals are more difficult to manage. Wind feels sharper. The mind itself can grow narrower after a long day. Because of this, skilled winter travelers often behaved as if evening began before the sun touched the horizon. Their decisions respected the coming dark ahead of time. This respect for sequence explains another major difference between their world and ours. Mountain men did not separate survival mode from ordinary conduct as sharply as modern people do. Their methods were built into the full day. The way they dressed in the morning was already part of the night. The way they climbed a ridge was already part of camp. The way they ate at noon was already part of late afternoon strength. The way they protected dry material was already part of tomorrow's departure. Survival did not begin when things went wrong. It was the pattern that kept things from going too wrong in the first place. There is also the matter of route reading under snow and ice. Travel across winter country is never just travel on top of a surface. It is travel through hidden conditions. Crust strength shifts. Drifts hide holes. Ice varies by current, depth, and recent weather. Stream edges can be treacherous where flow undercuts appearances. Wet ground can sit beneath thin, freezing layers. The mountain men learned to test, judge, and distrust surfaces in useful ways. They were not always right. No one can be. Yet they understood that winter covers the land without making it simple. What appears firm may not be. What appears direct may hold concealed cost. That cautious intelligence is one of the least glamorous and most valuable elements in old cold weather practice. Another piece of their technique involved accepting discomfort in order to avoid danger. This is harder than it sounds. Modern people often read discomfort as a sign that something is wrong right now and must be corrected immediately. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes slight chill during movement is the very thing preserving safety. Sometimes a less comfortable camp location is actually the wiser one because it offers better wind protection or drier ground. Sometimes stopping short of exhaustion feels unsatisfying but protects the next hours. Sometimes working while still warm feels inconvenient but prevents a much colder crisis later. The mountain men were trained by necessity to choose longer safety over short comfort, and this alone may explain a great deal of their relative success. Think about sweat once more, because it sits near the center of the whole method. Sweat is almost invisible while it is forming. It often accompanies effort that feels productive and strong. The body works. Heat rises, clothing softens with warmth. The person feels efficient, but winter is patient. It waits for exertion to stop. Then the dampness stored in clothing begins to reshape the body's future. The mountain men who understood this treated effort as something to be moderated, not merely maximized. They climbed with more care. They adjusted layers earlier. They watched the signs on the chest, back, neck, and feet. They did not allow the work of 1 hour to sabotage the next 3. That is not dramatic wisdom. It is applied restraint. Their methods around drying were equally practical. A damp garment near a fire cannot simply be thrown carelessly into heat and forgotten. Leather can stiffen, shrink, or suffer. Wool can be managed better, but still requires attention. Small articles matter because small failures compound. Socks, wrappings, liners, gloves, inner cloth, and anything next to skin can influence the body's next phase of functioning. The mountain men did not always have the luxury of full drying, yet they were far less likely to ignore dampness as a secondary issue. They knew that retained moisture travels with the body into the future. It must be reduced where possible, not postponed indefinitely. Cold weather technique also involved reading one's own body with honesty. This may be the deepest difference between old winter skill and modern dependence on equipment. Gear can extend capability, but it can also muffle awareness. The mountain men learned to treat bodily signals as operational facts. A sudden change in finger sensation, a foot going strangely quiet, an unusual heaviness after hunger, a sharp increase in clumsiness, a level of sweating beyond what the conditions justified, a dry mouth ignored too long, a fatigue that made camp work seem mentally larger than it should. These were not minor feelings to be brushed aside. They were information. A person who survives well in winter becomes a reliable reader of himself. That reliability can fade in comfortable cultures. Modern life encourages people to outsource many forms of attention. Thermostats hold temperature stable. Vehicles compress distance and exposure. Waterproof membranes, synthetic fills, and sealed systems reduce the visibility of small errors. Forecasting and connectivity lower uncertainty. These are real gains, yet one quiet cost is that people need less intimate knowledge of their own thermal state. The mountain men had no such luxury. If their body began shifting toward trouble, they had to catch it themselves. No alert appeared. No rescue promise stood behind them. That necessity sharpened perception. The same sharpening shaped their relationship to wind. Wind is one of winter's great translators. It takes moderate cold and turns it into something harsher. It strips heat through openings, seams, damp cloth, exposed hands, and unprotected resting places. A mountain man learned to think not just about temperature, but about moving air. A place that looks adequate in stillness may become foolish once wind sweeps it. A camp with access to fuel but poor wind protection may be worse than a less convenient spot with calmer shelter. A ridge crossed quickly might still cost too much if the body is already damp. Wind changes the value of every other choice. Old travelers who respected it survived better than those who treated it as an afterthought. They also handled terrain with more humility. Winter magnifies the cost of poor footing, exposed lines, and unnecessary effort. A straight path is not always the best one. A slope that saves minutes may demand sweat, risk a fall, or leave the body too depleted for camp labor. A creek bank that looks simple may hide rotten ice or soaked ground. A sheltered route through timber may be slower but protect heat and morale. The mountain men knew that terrain and temperature cannot be separated. The land does not merely carry the body through cold, It changes how the cold acts upon the body. That is why route choice was part of thermal management, not merely navigation. Then there is the question of how they rested during the day. Rest sounds harmless, but in winter the body can cool fast once activity stops. Old winter travelers often used short pauses differently from long halts. A brief stop to assess, eat, adjust, or breathe did not need to become full stillness. Sometimes it was wiser to keep the body from sinking too far into passivity. Long stops without good reason could allow dampness and air to begin undoing the previous hour's work. The mountain men seem to have understood that the body in cold often prefers continuity. Not constant strain, but careful flow. Move, adjust, preserve. Stop, but not carelessly. Work, but not past the point where heat becomes waste. This attention to flow also shaped the way they handled emergencies or near emergencies. A modern person suddenly frightened by exposure may overcorrect, rushing, sweating, overbuilding, overburning fuel, or making decisions that solve one immediate discomfort while worsening the overall picture. The mountain men, trained by repeated exposure, were more likely to fall back on sequence. Secure what must be secured first. Protect function. Protect dryness. Protect fuel. Protect the possibility of heat. Protect the next hours, not just the next minute. That steadiness did not make them invulnerable. It made them harder to unbalance. There is a temptation, when hearing all this, to reduce it to a tidy lesson. Stay dry. Pace yourself. Gather wood early. Choose shelter well. Those rules are good, but they still understate what made the mountain men effective. Their real difference was that these actions were not separate tips stored in the head. They were connected habits embedded in judgment. Sweat related to route. Route related to daylight. Daylight related to camp quality. Camp quality related to food and hand function. Hand function related to sequence. Sequence related to the next morning. Everything touched. Everything else. Winter became manageable only when a person thought in those links. This is why their skill can feel hard to imitate from a distance. It is easy to admire a single old tool or garment. It is harder to rebuild the mental world in which that tool belonged. A robe, a pair of moccasins, a fire kit, a blanket, a wool layer, a horse, a route, a timbered slope, a stream crossing, a ration of meat, and a cold dusk all mean different things. When viewed as parts of one system, the mountain men lived inside that system long enough for it to shape reflex. They did not have to invent every judgment fresh each day. Many decisions had already become second nature because winter had taught the same lesson over and over. A person listening now might ask whether modern people could not simply learn the same things while keeping the better gear. Of course, they could learn some of it, and many experienced cold weather travelers do. Good gear in disciplined hands is a real advantage. But that answer also points towards something deeper. The mountain men did not survive better because primitive hardship made them noble. They survived better because their habits had been trained by conditions modern life often buffers away. Their skill was born in an environment where poor technique had immediate penalties and sound technique had visible rewards. Repetition turned those penalties and rewards into instinct. When later generations looked back, they often noticed only the materials and missed the method. They saw skins, wool, fires, horses, frozen rivers, and rough camps. They saw men enduring winter with what seemed like less. What they did not always see was that the apparent lack of technology had forced a richness of judgment. The old travelers could not afford to be lazy with moisture, pace, fuel, or timing. Their lives trained them to make 1,000 small corrections. Modern people can enter the same conditions with gear that is technically far better, yet still fail if they assume the gear has replaced the corrections. So the question is no longer simply whether old clothing was good or bad, whether wool beats synthetic, whether fur beats fleece, or whether modern boots beat moccasins. Those comparisons have value, but they do not reach the heart of the matter. The mountain men did differently what winter always asks to be done differently. They managed sweat before it became danger. They treated fire as preparation, not fantasy. They chose camp with sequence in mind. They guarded hand and foot function. They respected wind, ground, and transitions. They moved with economy, not pride. They used discomfort as information. They accepted that staying alive in severe cold was less about overpowering weather than staying in rhythm with reality. And once that rhythm becomes visible, another layer begins to emerge. Beneath the methods sat a kind of perception modern people often lack. The old winter travelers were not just doing the right things mechanically. They were noticing the right things early enough to do them. Their truest advantage may not have been the techniques themselves, but the mental habits that made those techniques possible under pressure. That quieter advantage is harder to see than a fire or a robe or a pair of winter tracks crossing snow, but it may explain more than any object ever could. A person can learn every modern rule of winter travel, buy excellent equipment, memorize a list of symptoms, and still miss the thing that matters most. He can know, in theory, that cold is dangerous. He can know that moisture matters, that wind matters, that food matters, that camp should not be delayed too long. He can repeat all of that correctly and still fail to notice that his body has already begun drifting into trouble. This gap between knowing the rule and recognizing the moment is one of the most important differences between the mountain men and most people now. Their advantage was not only that they practiced certain methods, it was that they had trained themselves to read the body and the land almost continuously, without waiting for an obvious crisis. In that sense, what we lost was not merely a set of old techniques. We lost a style of attention. Modern life makes that loss easy to miss because so many environments around us are stabilized before we ever enter them. Temperature is regulated indoors. Cars collapse distance and exposure. Forecasts flatten uncertainty into easy numbers. Clothing labels give the impression that safety can be measured in advance and worn on the body. Devices promise contact, orientation, and rescue. All of these things are useful. Many save lives, but together they also produce a subtle change in the human relationship with weather. They allow people to move through cold without developing the same intimate sensitivity to small changes. The body still gives signals, the land still gives signals, but we need them less often, so we become less practiced in hearing them. This is not just a story about convenience making people careless. That would be too simple and too smug. The real shift is more interesting than that. Modern systems are built to remove friction. They spare attention. A heated room means a person does not have to read the quality of the previous evening's fire. Waterproof boots mean he may not have to think as much about snow type, ground saturation, and outer dampness. A car means the consequences of wet clothes or nightfall usually end quickly. A weather forecast gives an abstract picture of the day before the body has lived through any of it. A synthetic insulated layer continues performing well enough that the wearer may not notice early warning signs as sharply as someone whose materials made those problems more visible. In short, the environment becomes less conversational. It still affects us, but it does not demand the same degree of response. The mountain men lived in the opposite condition. Their world was not smooth. It pushed information onto them all the time. Leather stiffened, feet cooled, Firewood quality announced itself immediately. Wind found weak choices. Food shortage altered strength. Damp layers reminded the wearer of what had gone wrong. Mornings exposed the cost of the previous night's preparation. Routes punished overconfidence quickly. The body was not buffered enough for long mistakes to remain hidden. That meant attention, once developed, stayed active. A man had to notice early because the early signs were often the only warnings he would get before options narrowed. This is the first layer of the knowledge we lost, the habit of noticing before fear arrives. Most people now wait for stronger evidence than old winter travelers could afford to wait for. They wait to feel truly cold, truly tired, truly clumsy, truly worried. They want the problem to become emotionally clear before acting. But cold does not owe anyone emotional clarity. It often begins in mild inconvenience and vague signals. The mountain men understood that danger can be soft around the edges at first. That understanding changed the threshold at which they responded. Think of how many winter mistakes begin with a sensation small enough to dismiss: a little sweat down the back, slight tightness in a boot, fingers that feel less nimble but still functional, a wind shift that seems tolerable, the thought that camp can wait another half hour, the belief that hunger is merely discomfort and can be handled later, a little dampness around the socks, the assumption that the body will stay warm once movement stops because it feels warm now. Each of these is easy to excuse. Modern people excuse them constantly because our lives teach us that many small discomforts are temporary and low stakes. The mountain men lived in a system where small discomforts were often early messages. They did not have to dramatize them, they only had to respect them. That respect depended on a second, deeper layer of lost knowledge, reading the body as an instrument rather than a passenger. In much of modern life, the body is treated as something carried through plans. We set the schedule, we make the route, we wear the gear. We assume the body will tell us in clear language when something is wrong enough to demand revision. In severe cold, the body often speaks earlier and more quietly than that. A change in coordination, a certain kind of fatigue, dry mouth in cold air, unusual heaviness in the legs, delayed warmth in hands or feet, slight confusion in task order, loss of patience, urge to sit too long after exertion, difficulty doing small camp tasks. These are not always dramatic symptoms, but they can be highly meaningful. The mountain men learned to interpret such signs not as moods, but as operational facts. This kind of bodily literacy is hard to rebuild in cultures built around comfort and speed. Most people are not trained to observe subtle changes in thermal state because most daily life does not require it. We are used to environments where a problem can often be endured until it becomes obvious, and then fixed quickly. Cold wilderness, frontier country, and severe exposure do not always offer that luxury. The mountain men knew that body signals had to be read while the body was still capable of action. Waiting for certainty was often the wrong strategy. It narrowed options too far. There is also the matter of how modern people understand toughness. We often define it as the willingness to endure discomfort without complaint. That sounds admirable, and in some settings it is. But winter often punishes exactly that attitude when it becomes stubbornness. A person who prides himself on ignoring discomfort may ignore the very feedback that could keep him safe. The mountain men were certainly capable of enduring hardship, yet the men who survived well were not simply enduring machines. They were responsive. They did not prove strength by pretending the body had no limits. They proved competence by detecting when those limits were approaching and altering behavior in time. That difference matters because cold often undermines judgment gradually. A person can still feel determined while becoming less perceptive. He can still feel proud while losing fine motor control. He can still believe he is functioning well while the body is quietly narrowing his choices. The old winter travelers were not immune to this, but they lived close enough to consequence that they learned distrust for certain forms of confidence. Modern people are often encouraged to feel empowered by gear, by training labels, by technology, by metrics, and by identity. The mountain men learned something less flattering and more useful. Confidence is only valuable if it remains tied to conditions. When it drifts free of them, it becomes a liability. This leads to another kind of knowledge we lost, the ability to distinguish comfort from safety. The two overlap, but not as neatly as modern life suggests. Central heating, padded interiors, and engineered materials make it natural to assume that feeling good means being protected. In winter exposure, that assumption can turn on you. A person can feel warm because he is overdressed and sweating hard. He can feel comfortable stopping because movement has generated heat, even though damp layers are about to change everything. He can feel secure in camp because a fire is pleasant, even though the site is poorly protected from overnight wind. He can feel satisfied by a strong pace, even though that pace has robbed him of the strength needed for evening labor. The mountain men understood, often through costly experience, that comfort is a present feeling, while safety is a future condition. Those are not the same thing. Modern systems encourage present feeling. They are built to reduce discomfort now. The mountain men had to think farther ahead. If a slope invited too much sweating, the pleasant warmth it created was suspicious. If a camp looked convenient but exposed, the immediate ease of stopping there was suspect. If a body craved stillness too early, that craving had to be weighed against what remained to be done. This was not joyless living. It was simply a different mental arrangement. They were less likely to let current comfort overrule the logic of what the next few hours would demand. A modern person may hear all this and imagine that mountain men must have possessed a near mystical intimacy with nature. That is not necessary, and it is not accurate. Their knowledge was not mystical. It was recursive. The same lessons came back again and again. Sweat, then cooling. Hunger, then weakness. Delay, then poorer camp. Wet feet, then slower work. Wind exposure, then deeper heat loss. Nightfall, then compressed options. Because those patterns repeated, attention sharpened around them. Repetition built perception. What we lost was not some magical frontier instinct hidden in old blood. We lost repeated exposure severe enough to make certain patterns unforgettable. There is another layer to this loss that has less to do with the body and more to do with time. Modern people often think in shorter windows because our systems allow it. We plan by the hour, by the next task, by the visible route, by the checked forecast. The mountain men were often forced to think in linked time. What I do now affects how I sleep. How I sleep affects how I rise. How I rise affects what I can do tomorrow. A wet crossing in late afternoon is not just a late afternoon problem. It is a night problem, a morning problem, and possibly a route problem for the next day. An underfed evening is not just a hungry evening. It is weaker heat, weaker recovery, slower morning work. Their world taught them to project consequence across phases, not just moments. This time, depth shaped their decision-making in a way many modern people find unnatural. Modern culture prizes efficiency, momentum, completion, the feeling of progress. Severe winter often demands something different: interruption, adjustment, sometimes retreat, often earlier preparation than feels emotionally satisfying. The mountain men learned to see delay not only as a loss of speed, but sometimes as a gain of control. They learned that the right time to stop was often before the mind wanted to stop. They learned that a smaller success today could preserve greater strength tomorrow. That kind of judgment, does not come naturally in achievement-oriented cultures. It comes from environments where consequences are closely linked over time. What this means in practice is that the mountain men often lived with a more accurate sense of margin. Margin is one of those concepts modern people recognize only when it begins disappearing. The battery is almost dead. Daylight is almost gone. Fuel is almost enough. Food is almost enough. Warmth is almost holding. The mountain men treated margin more consciously because they had to. They understood that a person in severe cold is never dealing only with the current condition. He is dealing with the gap between what he has and what the next phase will require. A man might be warm enough now and still be in poor shape if his woodpile is too small, his clothing too damp, his food too thin, his camp too exposed, or his route too ambitious for the time left. Margin, not present sensation alone, was the true measure. Modern gear can obscure this. A highly efficient jacket, tent, stove, or insulated boot can widen margin enormously, which is genuinely valuable. But because that margin feels built into the object, the user may stop monitoring it with the same vigilance. He assumes the jacket is the margin, the stove is the margin, the boot is the margin. The mountain men had fewer reasons to believe margin lived in one place. For them, it lived in combinations. Clothing plus pace, plus dryness, plus fuel, plus shelter, plus food, plus timing. This made their view less convenient, but more realistic. It also made them harder to fool. When one part weakened, they knew the whole picture had changed. Another piece of lost knowledge concerns the way we read weather. Modern forecasting is powerful, but it can create passivity. People begin to treat the weather as something known because a number has been supplied. Temperature, wind speed, chance of precipitation, these are useful abstractions, but they are not lived conditions. A basin, a ridge, a river bottom, wet timber, open plain, crusted snowfield, and sunless gully do not feel like the same forecast. The mountain men learned weather through locality. They knew that one valley held cold differently from another. They knew how wind behaved in certain openings. They knew how cloud thickness felt when it meant one thing instead of another. They knew snow textures, stream behavior, and the language of small changes. Their knowledge was less universal and more exact. What we often have now is the reverse. Broader information, weaker local reading. That trade makes sense in a mobile society, but it can be dangerous in wilderness or severe exposure because the body still experiences local weather, not forecast weather. A person armed with good data can still be surprised by the actual feel of a slope, a crossing, a pocket of damp air, or a line of wind. The mountain men were trained by place to expect those differences. Their experience made them skeptical of general conditions when local signs suggested something else. This local literacy connected directly to their emotional steadiness. Fear grows when conditions feel arbitrary. If snow, wind, darkness, hunger, and bodily signals arrive as unrelated threats, the mind begins to narrow. The mountain men did not remove uncertainty, but they lived among enough repeating patterns that uncertainty became structured. They were less likely to be shocked by what winter tends to do at certain hours, in certain places, after certain efforts. That does not make a person brave in a theatrical sense. It makes him less mentally wasteful. He spends less energy on surprise. More remains for action. Mental waste is another modern problem. Severe cold exposes quickly. A tired, uncomfortable, half-hungry person can spend enormous energy arguing internally with reality. This should not be happening. The wind should ease. The camp should be good enough. The crossing should have worked. I should not have to stop yet. I can push 1 more hour. My gear should handle this. Much of this inner argument comes from living in a world where conditions usually do respond to intention. Machines obey. Rooms warm. Roads connect. Help is reachable. The mountain men had fewer grounds for such argument. The land would not adjust to their preferences, so good judgment required adjusting sooner to the land. What we lost, in part, was that form of humility. Humility may sound like a moral decoration, but in winter it is practical. A humble traveler changes plans sooner. He notices smaller warnings. He does not force a route because it looked simple on paper. He does not assume strong gear eliminates weak timing. He does not treat his own confidence as evidence. The mountain men were not saints of humility, but the ones who lasted learned its usefulness. Pride in severe cold can become expensive very fast. Humility preserves flexibility, and flexibility preserves life. There is also the question of distraction. Modern people live in highly interrupted attention. Even in outdoor contexts, many carry habits formed by phones, clocks, schedules, messages, and fragmented focus. The mountain men lived in a far slower informational environment. That did not make them wiser in every respect, but it did allow another form of concentration to develop. Their attention remained in the immediate material world, more continuously. Weather, terrain, animals, body, daylight, tools, food, and camp all stayed close in the mind because there was little else competing with them. In that sense, one lost frontier skill is simply sustained attentiveness to reality. Severe cold rewards monotony of attention far more than modern life trains it. This matters most in transitional moments, the very moments modern people often blur through. A person today may move from vehicle to trail, trail to camp, camp to sleep system to morning routine with an assumption that objects and plans will hold the thread. The mountain men had to keep holding the thread themselves. They had to remain mentally present during the shift, from movement to camp, from warmth to cooling, from light to dark, from effort to maintenance, from hunger to recovery. These were the moments when small failures appeared. Their skill was partly the ability to stay mentally alive during the boring or tiring transitions where modern people often drift. Boredom itself is worth mentioning. Modern discomfort is often accompanied by the expectation that it should end soon. That expectation breeds restlessness. Winter work on the frontier involved repetitive tasks whose significance might not feel dramatic in the moment. Collecting more fuel than seems necessary, arranging bedding carefully, adjusting damp garments, checking animals, choosing exact placement, rationing strength, repeating routine. A modern person may become impatient with such tasks because they do not feel like progress. The mountain men knew they were progress. Their patience was practical. We have lost, in many cases, the willingness to spend energy on unglamorous preparation without immediate emotional reward. The same can be said of sensory honesty. Many modern people are surprisingly unpracticed at describing what their body is actually feeling in cold. They say warm, cold, tired, fine, wet. The mountain men likely worked with a more detailed internal map, because detail mattered. Is the moisture on the back increasing? Are the feet warming from movement or merely numbing less? Is the wind cutting through one side more than the other? Are the fingers clumsy from chill or from general fatigue? Is the face stinging because of exposure or because the body as a whole is slipping? This precision does not require technical language. It requires regular necessity. What we lost is not vocabulary, but granularity. Granularity changes behavior because it allows earlier correction. A person who can detect the specific kind of dampness forming inside layers is more likely to open clothing soon enough. A person who notices that fatigue is making him mentally slow in camp tasks may stop pretending there is time for one more push. A person who feels the distinct wrongness of feet cooling after a wet crossing may act earlier to preserve the night. The mountain men became better at such distinctions because their lives kept testing them. Subtlety had value. Crude categories did not suffice. There is also a broader historical loss here. The mountain men belonged to a world where knowledge moved through watching, imitation, trial, oral exchange, and shared labor. Much of cold weather understanding was practical before it was verbal. A younger man might see what an older one did at a stop, how he opened clothing before the climb, when he chose ground, how he handled damp material, how he paced an animal, how he approached a crossing late in the day. These small observations formed a kind of apprenticeship. Modern culture offers plenty of information, but much of it arrives disembodied, as advice detached from lived repetition. People can consume excellent knowledge and still fail to embody it because embodiment requires rhythm, context, correction, and consequence. This is one reason advice alone rarely recreates the mountain men's edge. You can tell someone to stay dry, but unless he has felt the specific chain from sweat to chill to clumsy camp work to miserable night, the rule remains abstract. You can tell someone not to delay camp, but unless he has felt dusk turn his hands dull and his options thin, the rule may not take root deeply. The mountain men lived in a world where the feedback was fast enough and harsh enough to teach embodiment. That educational structure is mostly gone for ordinary people, and we should be grateful for that in many ways. But it does mean the old knowledge is harder to absorb. The final lost element may be the simplest and hardest to recover, an understanding that severe cold is not conquered by one grand success. It is managed by maintaining relationship. The mountain men did not win against winter once and for all, when they bought the right garment or lit the right fire or crossed the right pass. They stayed in dialogue with conditions hour after hour. They accepted that the body would keep changing, that the land would keep changing, that the quality of their margin would keep changing. That ongoing relationship is tedious to minds trained to seek stable answers, yet it is the truth of exposure. Winter remains dynamic, whether we acknowledge it or not. Modern people often want certainty before action. They want a reason large enough to justify stopping, adjusting, eating, drying, relayering, turning back, or choosing the less satisfying option. The mountain men seem to have worked with a lower threshold. They acted on indications. They changed things while the evidence was still modest. They trusted patterns more than mood. They did not need to feel dramatic danger to accept that a sequence was drifting the wrong way. This may sound like a small difference, but in severe conditions, it is enormous. It is the difference between correction and rescue. What we lost, then, was not only old material culture or old hardships or some romantic closeness to raw nature. We lost a layered way of perceiving. We lost the reflex to treat minor signals as meaningful. We lost some ability to distinguish present comfort from future safety. We lost patience for preventive effort. We lost local weather reading in favor of abstract certainty. We lost embodied apprenticeship in favor of general advice. We lost humility before conditions that do not bend to preference. And perhaps most of all, we lost the habit of keeping the mind engaged in the long, quiet middle of the process before the story becomes dramatic enough for anyone to call it survival. That is why the mountain men could appear stronger in the cold than many people equipped far better than they were. Their true advantage was not simple toughness. It was perception, trained by necessity. They saw trouble sooner. They recognized false comfort sooner. They treated small signs more seriously. They projected consequence farther ahead. Their methods arose from this perception, but the perception came first. Without it, technique becomes rule following. With it, technique becomes timing. And once that becomes clear, another question begins to rise. If modern people are not necessarily weaker, if our materials are not necessarily worse, and if the old advantage lay so much in perception, then why do we still struggle when the cold turns serious? Why do capable, prepared, intelligent people continue to make avoidable winter mistakes? The answer lies not only in what was lost, but in how modern life trains us to depend on systems that work beautifully right up until they do not. The old mountain men did not survive winter because they belonged to a tougher species of human being. Their hands were made of the same flesh, their lungs breathed the same cold air, and their bodies lost heat by the same rules that govern ours now. If they had been born into our century, most of them would probably have grown soft in the same ways we do, because human beings adapt to the world that surrounds them. And if many of us had been born into theirs, some would have learned what they learned, though not without cost. That matters, because it keeps this story from becoming a sermon about decline. The point is not that modern people are weak and old frontier people were strong. The point is that modern life teaches a different set of reflexes, and those reflexes work beautifully in the world they were built for. They only become dangerous when we carry them into conditions that do not forgive them. That is why capable people still struggle in severe cold, even when they own better materials, better forecasts, better maps, better stoves, better tents, better lighting, and better medical knowledge than the mountain men ever had. All of those advantages are real, yet they often sit inside a larger habit of dependence. Modern people are accustomed to systems that absorb error. Roads remain drivable after small mistakes. Heated interiors erase the cost of arriving damp. A car, lodge, cabin, station, trailhead, or house often sits somewhere within reach. Batteries can fail, forecasts can miss, and engines can refuse to start, but most days the wider structure still catches us. That repeated experience builds a quiet assumption into the mind. The assumption is that conditions may become uncomfortable, but rarely final. The mountain men were not allowed to think that way for long. This assumption shapes behavior long before anyone notices it. A person moves faster than he should, because the day seems manageable. He postpones food because he expects to solve discomfort later. He keeps climbing in full layers because his clothing is rated for far colder temperatures, and that feels reassuring. He delays camp because he imagines the consequences of lateness as inconvenience rather than collapse of margin. He trusts a route because technology says it is direct. He assumes his hands can be warmed whenever necessary. He believes that if the weather worsens, there will still be enough strength, daylight, and equipment to repair the situation. Modern life trains this optimism almost invisibly, not because people are foolish, but because in ordinary life, that optimism is often rewarded. The trouble begins when that ordinary optimism meets a severe environment that still obeys older rules. Cold does not care what the product description promised. It does not care how experienced a person feels in milder settings. It does not care that the route was efficient in summer, or that yesterday's forecast looked gentle, or that the boots cost a great deal, or that the emergency blanket is still somewhere in the pack. When conditions begin to narrow, the body returns to timeless limits. Heat leaves, moisture matters, light fades, strength becomes finite. Fine motor control weakens, the next task grows heavier. Fear may arrive too late to be useful. In that moment, the modern person is suddenly standing closer to the mountain men's world than he expected, but often without the habits that world used to teach. One reason we struggle today is that modern systems encourage abstraction. We think in categories, labels, and forecasts: 10 degrees, 30-mile wind, waterproof, 4-season, rated to -20. Technically, these abstractions are helpful. They let us compare, plan, and communicate. But the body never experiences abstract weather. It experiences a specific ridge, a wet slope, a sheltered hollow, an exposed crossing, a stiff boot, a damp back, a hungry afternoon, a late camp, a stove that takes longer than expected, gloves too clumsy for one task and too thin for another, an animal trail that vanishes under drifted snow, or a frozen stream edge that was not supposed to soften there. The mountain men lived in specifics. Modern people often prepare in generalities. That gap can remain hidden until reality demands a more detailed response than the mind is ready to give. The dependence on abstraction also changes how people read warning signs. A modern traveler may think, "The temperature is not that low," and overlook the fact that wind, moisture, fatigue, and late hour have combined into something much harsher than the number suggests. He may think, "My jacket is sufficient for these conditions," and fail to account for how much sweat now sits underneath it. He may think, "The forecast did not call for serious danger," and let that broad judgment override the local truth of the terrain around him. The mountain men had no forecast strong enough to silence the evidence in front of them. Their weather was the weather they could see, feel, smell, hear, and test. That did not make them infallible. It made them more anchored to the immediate world. Another reason modern people struggle is that our environments separate us from the consequences of poor sequence. Consider how many daily tasks now occur in conditions where sequence barely matters. You can come home hungry and eat. You can get slightly wet and dry off quickly. You can leave something for later, because later is still warm, lit, and reachable. You can delay preparation because the building already exists. You can trust that morning will not expose the errors of the previous evening in any severe way. Under those conditions, people naturally stop thinking in chains of consequence. They think in isolated problems. The mountain men could not afford that. In winter country, nothing stayed isolated for long. A late stop became poor camp. Poor camp became weak sleep. Weak sleep became slow morning. Slow morning became missed ground. Dampness became chill. Chill became clumsiness. Hunger became weaker firework. Everything touched everything else. Modern life tends to hide those links until something goes wrong enough to reveal them all at once. That is partly why severe cold can feel so shocking even to intelligent, prepared people. A person may think he is dealing with one problem, and suddenly realize he is dealing with 5 linked problems instead. The stove is slow, but the hands are also cooling. The camp is exposed, but daylight is also nearly gone. The feet are wet, but the fuel pile is also too small. The body is tired, but food is also delayed. The mind has been trained to solve one thing at a time, yet winter often demands a broader view. The mountain men lived closer to that broader view because their world forced it daily. Our world usually does not. There is also the matter of overconfidence, though not in the crude sense of arrogance alone. Modern overconfidence often looks reasonable. It wears the shape of preparedness. Someone has researched the route, bought the gear, watched videos, packed safety equipment, checked the weather, and perhaps done similar trips before. None of that is empty. It all matters. But it can create a subtle belief that competence has already been secured in advance. The mountain men had fewer chances to believe that because their knowledge was constantly retested by exposure. For them, competence was not what you packed or even what you knew in principle. It was what remained true after hours of moving, sweating, eating badly, handling wind, fixing gear, reading ground, working in the dark, and waking cold. Their confidence, when earned, was less theoretical. This difference shows up clearly in emergencies. A modern person who runs into trouble may still think like a person moving through a managed system. He may assume that one decisive action will restore order. Put on the heavy layer, build the fire, pitch the tent, eat the bar, use the device, follow the map. These actions are often correct, but the expectation beneath them can be misleading. In severe cold, order is not always restored by one action. It is rebuilt through a sequence, and that sequence works only if the body still has enough function left to carry it out. The mountain men knew this, not because they enjoyed hardship, but because their lives had taught them that recovery is labor. Modern people sometimes expect relief before the work of relief is complete. Technology can sharpen this expectation. GPS, satellite communication, insulated systems, instant stoves, weather apps, synthetic fabrics, battery-powered lighting, and vehicle access are all forms of extraordinary human achievement. Yet one side effect of extraordinary reliability is that people forget how to think when reliability breaks unevenly. If the stove works, the tent works, the forecast works, the battery works, and the route works, the day feels secure. If one of those fails, people still often assume the others will carry the situation. Sometimes they do. Sometimes failure clusters. Then the person suddenly finds himself in a far older bargain with the cold, except he has been trained for convenience and redundancy, not for stripped-down judgment under narrowing margin. It is also worth noticing how modern identity shapes winter behavior. Many people meet hard conditions with a story about themselves already in place. I am experienced. I am fit. I am outdoorsy. I am resilient. I have done worse. I know what I am doing. The mountain men surely had pride too, but the environment they lived in often punished identity when it drifted away from reality. Modern culture, by contrast, rewards identity performance constantly. People are encouraged to think of themselves in categories and to protect those categories emotionally. In severe cold, this can become dangerous because it raises the cost of changing course. Turning back, stopping early, eating sooner, resting differently, or admitting that the day has changed can feel like a threat to self-image rather than a simple response to conditions. The mountain men were not free from vanity, but the land kept reminding them that reputation did not warm a camp or dry a garment. This connects to one of the most striking modern weaknesses, the urge to continue because the original plan still exists in the mind. We are trained by schedules, bookings, routes, goals, and optimized time to value completion. If the map says camp is 3 more miles, then the mind wants those 3 miles to remain the task. If the plan says summit then descend, the mind clings to that structure. If the day is supposed to unfold in a certain way, changing it can feel like disorder. The mountain men lived with far less illusion that a plan deserved loyalty after conditions shifted. They adjusted more readily because they knew the land was not obligated to honor intention. Severe cold still teaches that same lesson, but many modern people hear it late because modern life usually rewards persistence more often than revision. We also struggle because we have become highly specialized. A person may be excellent at one narrow area of outdoor competence and still weak in others. He may know equipment intimately, but read weather poorly. He may navigate well but manage sweat badly. He may hike strongly but neglect camp sequence. He may understand cold injuries in theory but fail to preserve food timing. He may own superb clothing but choose ground carelessly. Specialization is part of modern progress. The mountain men, by contrast, lived in a world where knowledge had to stay integrated. Clothing, shelter, fuel, route, food, body, animals, and weather were not separate hobbies or skill modules. They were parts of one lived system. Modern people often know more facts, but in a more divided way. This division matters because winter punishes separation. A person cannot trade poor judgment in camp placement for a great waterproof shell and expect the exchange to hold forever. He cannot substitute strong legs for weak moisture management. He cannot offset hunger indefinitely with morale. He cannot replace local reading with brand trust. At some point, all the separate pieces have to function together. The mountain men did not always excel because they had superior pieces. They excelled because their knowledge was less compartmentalized. Modern life tends to produce the opposite. We master tools without fully rebuilding the environment of thought those tools need. Another source of modern struggle is the way we relate to discomfort psychologically. Most people today are used to quick correction. Cold fingers get rewarmed, wet clothes get changed, hot food appears. A poor night is temporary because the next night will likely be better. This shortens patience for preventive work and lengthens tolerance for risky delay. People put off adjustments because they are used to environments where delay has small consequences. In severe cold, delay often raises the price of the same correction. Changing a layer after the body is soaked is harder than changing earlier. Building shelter after exhaustion is harder than building sooner. Rewarming hands after they have lost fine control is harder than protecting them beforehand. The mountain men learned the arithmetic of delay in a harsher school. That arithmetic is one reason modern accidents continue happening to capable people. The issue is not always ignorance. Often it is timing. People know what should be done, but they do it later than winter allows. They eat when they are already drained. They stop when they are already clumsy. They dry things when there is no longer enough heat or fuel to do it well. They look for a better camp after the last easy chances have passed. They rely on a fire after hands have grown awkward. They use the big insulated layer after sweat has already loaded the inner clothing. None of these are absurd choices on paper. They are simply late. The mountain men's advantage so often lived in being earlier. Modern people also struggle because we are less practiced at reading partial failure. In old frontier life, conditions rarely had to fail completely to become serious. One weakness in a system changed the whole day. A lost animal, a damp robe, thin food, wind in camp, slow firewood, a bad crossing. The mountain men were used to operating inside imperfect conditions. Modern systems often work so well when intact that people become brittle when they begin to degrade. If the car cannot start, if the stove malfunctions, if the tent zipper fails, if the battery drains faster than expected, the user may become disproportionately unsettled because he has not spent much time functioning well in partially broken systems. The mountain men lived there almost by default. They were not waiting for perfection to act intelligently. This brittleness shows up not only in gear dependence, but in mental dependence on certainty. Many people today want to know what the correct answer is in advance. What exact layer? What exact route? What exact response to temperature, wind, dampness, terrain, and effort? Yet winter often refuses exact answers because the situation is moving. A slope climbed in morning sun may need one approach. The same slope crossed later with wind and fatigue may need another. The mountain men were not operating from fixed formulas. They were adjusting inside ranges. Modern people often seek precision where what is really needed is responsiveness. That can create hesitation. They wait to feel sure instead of acting on developing signs. Another deep reason we struggle lies in the disappearance of lived apprenticeship. Many people now learn cold weather skills from articles, videos, courses, fragments of advice, or occasional trips. Some of that teaching is excellent, but much of the old advantage came from long repetition in real conditions, often beside others who embodied sound judgment. You could watch when someone opened his layers, where he chose to stop, how he managed dampness, what he did first at camp, how he treated food, how he protected hands, how he responded to a shift in wind or snow. That kind of learning is hard to replace because it trains the eyes as much as the memory. Modern culture provides information in enormous quantity, but information alone does not create timing. The mountain men had timing because their world rehearsed it constantly. This is one reason people with plenty of knowledge still make avoidable cold weather errors. They understand the principles but do not yet feel the sequence in their bones. They know that sweat is dangerous, but not exactly how little extra exertion will tip them there. They know camp should not be delayed, but not yet how dusk changes hand function and judgment. They know feet matter, but not how fast a soaked crossing late in the day can begin altering the whole night. They know hunger weakens warmth, but not how underfeeding shapes the mood of decisions hours later. The mountain men did not just know these things. They had lived them enough times that the lessons moved faster than conscious thought. There is also a cultural factor at work. Modern life tends to frame nature as either recreational backdrop or crisis event. It is something we visit for pleasure or something that appears in warnings and disasters. The mountain men lived in neither frame. For them, the environment was simply the world in which labor took place. That created a steadier mental posture. They were less likely to alternate between overconfidence and panic because winter was not a special occasion. It was an ordinary force with extraordinary consequences if misread. Many modern people lack that middle posture. They either assume the outdoors is manageable because it is part of leisure, or they only grasp its seriousness when the situation has already turned dramatic. Severe cold punishes that swing. Another modern weakness is our discomfort with monotony. The old winter disciplines are repetitive. Check layers, check feet, check wind, gather extra wood, protect dry things, stop early enough. Eat before you feel like it matters. Keep attention on transitions. These do not feel exciting. They do not make strong social stories. They do not flatter the ego. Modern people, raised on stimulation, often find it easier to imagine a grand survival move than to respect the quiet repetition that prevents a survival story from happening. The mountain men endured those repetitions because they belonged to work, not because they were inspiring. We struggle partly because prevention feels dull until it becomes the difference between comfort and danger. This leads back to the central modern problem. We trust systems more than we trust perception. We trust the jacket, the tent, the app, the route, the rating, the vehicle, the stove, the battery, the itinerary, the map line, the rescue plan. Again, most of the time this trust is justified, but systems work best when paired with a user who keeps reading reality rather than replacing reality with expectation. The mountain men had less choice about this. Their systems were weaker in many ways, so their perception had to grow stronger. We possess stronger systems, but often at the cost of letting perception atrophy. Then, when systems fail or conditions outgrow them, people discover that the oldest part of the equation was always the human mind-reading change. And yet it would be a mistake to conclude that we are trapped by this loss. The point of looking back is not despair. It is clarity. Many modern cold weather failures are not proof that better gear was a false promise. Better gear remains a gift. Better medicine, communication, forecasting, and rescue remain gifts. The lesson is that material improvement did not erase the old rules. It only made it easier to forget them. The mountain men still have something to teach, not because we should romanticize their hardships or imitate every element of their lives, but because they were trained to notice what modern systems often hide. They remind us that severe cold is still a conversation between body, moisture, wind, effort, food, light, shelter, ground, and timing. No century has repealed that. In fact, the best modern winter traveler is probably not the person who rejects technology in admiration of the past. It is the person who combines modern advantages with older attentiveness. Someone who uses the forecast but still reads the valley. Someone who owns excellent clothing but opens and closes it with discipline. Someone who carries strong shelter but does not delay camp foolishly. Someone who trusts his gear without surrendering judgment to it. Someone who understands that comfort can mislead, that sweat is expensive, that transitions matter, that hands and feet are clocks as much as tools, that food is heat in another form, that wind changes everything, and that the next hour must always be included in the current decision. That kind of traveler has something the mountain men would have recognized immediately, even if the materials seemed miraculous. He has relationship rather than dependency. He is not asking equipment to save him from his own inattention. He is using it to widen the margin already created by good habits. The mountain men would likely have valued that distinction because they knew how narrow life becomes when habit is poor. They also knew how much quieter winter becomes when behavior and conditions begin to align. Perhaps that is the last and simplest answer to the question that began all of this. We have better gear, but the mountain men often survived better in the cold because they possessed a style of living that made them harder to surprise. Their knowledge sat not only in objects but in sequence, in margin, in timing, in humility, in local reading, in refusal to confuse comfort with safety, and in the willingness to act before danger looked dramatic enough to impress anybody. We struggle today because modern life usually spares us from needing that kind of attention, and what is not needed often fades. We inherit warmth easily, so we do not always learn the structure beneath it. We inherit rescue possibilities, so we do not always cultivate early correction. We inherit convenience, so we do not always rehearse the patient disciplines that severe cold still demands. And yet winter itself has not changed as much as we have. It still turns sweat against the body. It still punishes delay. It still narrows options after dark. It still rewards shelter chosen well and work done early. It still favors people who listen before they are frightened. That is why the mountain men still matter. Not because they belong to a superior past, but because their lives reveal the permanent grammar of cold. Strip away the myths, the fur trade romance, the portraits of solitary toughness, and what remains is something more valuable. A record of people who learned, through repetition and consequence, how to stay in working agreement with an environment that never stopped asking for honesty. If these quiet journeys through the past mean something to you, subscribe before you drift off and come back for the next one. And tell me, before the night grows any later, what corner of the world you are listening from and what time the darkness says it is there. There is something fitting in that too. People in different rooms, under different skies, thinking about the same old lessons carried across snow, timber, wind, and distance by men who understood that survival was rarely one grand act. It was a tension, sustained long enough to make it to morning. And morning, for them, was always the true proof. Not the pose beside the fire, not the legend told later, not the image of a man wrapped in fur against a white horizon, but the simpler fact of waking, able to rise, able to move, able to work, able to continue. That was the measure Winter used. It is still the measure now. The mountain men did not beat the cold by being immune to it. They stayed alive by entering each day with fewer illusions about what the cold would ask. We have better tools. They had fewer illusions. In the end, that may explain almost everything.